So yeah, well, it's actually it's a great pleasure to be here because I started out my teaching career, which I had to cut short about 15 years ago. But I started out here in sort of 1981 and 82 and 83, and it was kind of classic, wonderful, wonderful time. So I have a very, very soft spot for what was PCL then anyway, and is now University of Westminster architecture. So tonight I sort of call this, it's a technical kind of, it's about making things obviously, but it's I'm going to talk about stone and I'm going to talk about ceramic, and I've got 3 projects of each. And it is in a way also a discussion about material and context. So, you know, that's always the bridge, you know, materials on their own are kind of fascinating, amazing, but when it becomes part of a conversation about the materiality of a building and its position, it becomes very special. It becomes unique because it's interesting just to think about what architecture is in that respect, unlike, you know, the painter's world or the sculptor's world generally. And of course there are the edges of architecture which are close to nomadism and transience, fabriques and installations and so on, which are different. But actually a building occupies a unique place on earth. So it has this very special character. It isn't just a go-anywhere event. It takes, even if the building is capable of that, the ground upon which it sits is absolutely particular. And working mostly in London, as we do, that is drawn back to you as a shockwave, you know, all the time, because actually the streets are the most permanent part of a city in a way. The streets, the squares, public places, the shared territory. The buildings kind of come and go, but the streets are there. And as soon as you cut ground in a city, you realize you're revealing a stratigraphy of human life, which is just fantastic. That I think is what I would like to emphasize in this sort of sense of where we go. And the first project actually stems of the first of the 3 stone examples. Is probably one of the earliest projects in the practice. Goes back to the 80s, kind of 86, 87, something like that, where we undertook a master plan for Pembroke College, which is a college that's been in continuous occupation for something like 650 years. So it's grown a bit, but you realize that these people who are the clients, who are a building committee, have this real sense of responsibility. So we were asked to show how on the site of a lodge, which took the principal, and a garden for the teaching fellowship, how we could put on that, or how we could put around the college actually a lot more rooms. They wanted 100 rooms more, and they wanted teaching spaces, and they wanted a location. So this is just one of the drawings from that master plan, which is a crayon drawing, and what it actually it shows a sort of length cut through the college. We're just beyond Wren's first building. So Christopher Wren built the chapel, and then we get a Waterhouse library, and Waterhouse wanted to pull down Christopher Wren's building because he thought it wasn't terribly good, and he wanted to make the tallest kind of campanile in Cambridge. And then you've got Scott, and you've got other architects kind of working around the edge of the campus of the site. And the intervention here was one about height, 1, 2, 3, 4 stories there, a new master's lodge, principal's lodge, And the question was, is it brick or is it stone? I mean, I know that sounds... So once you've shunted... the next slide is the built version, actually, many years later. So it was finished in 97. Essentially, it's sort of 3 stories. This is, at the end, is the lodge, which has a sort of front door on the town and then an inner door this way. And it's a kind of building with 17 elevations. So this is the sort of first sketch of the layout. So, you know, here it is. It clings to a road. This is the interior. Those are those wonderful plane trees you just saw in that image. So these were just the first drawings of a layout which showed sort of secondary courts. So we're sitting back between trees that had to be kept and creating smaller court spaces, and then you know, a series of intimate spaces and the bigger space and so on. The point I make is, whilst this business of kind of beginning to formulate a configuration for a building, a complex building with lots of parts to it, at the same time one's thinking about materials. And what I'd like to say is that, you know, the punt that you make as a designer at certain points, it's that intuition which is incredibly important for the sort of for the project. And the planning is one thing, but the punt about a sort of sense of what the materiality will be is the beginning of a long journey. It's like a novelist, I guess, sketching out a novel and then filling it out. So it's a very potent thing. These were 2 little sketches. I'm sorry they're kind of quiet, but you know, what I wanted to do was, in each of these rooms, which student rooms, to have 2 windows. And this is the first sketch of a stone manifestation of the 2 windows, where I wanted to make a big lintel of stone that spanned 3 meters, 3.3 meters or something like that. You get a big window and a small window. The small window has a kind of shutter in it. There's a bookcase, and then there's the big window that goes right to the floor to give light in. And, you know, I'll come to describe this a bit more, but that sketch, actually, which shows the idea of a recess that would hold the 2 windows, becomes a journey in terms of making that is lengthy and very, very interesting. And it was the first time, actually, that I started a dialogue with Arabs, who are our engineers, and a wonderful guy called Turlo O'Brien, who was their sort of research guy on materials. And before they now have a group called Arab Facade Engineers, and I've worked on most of my projects with those guys in terms of creating the detail, going through the specification, making sure that, you know, liabilities are covered, and so on and so forth. But it is therefore, it's a room, this is a typical student room, which has just got it's got a nice big heavy door frame on the outside and no bead to the inside, in order that the bed can be this direction or the other direction. It sounds simple, but it's just to give that flexibility. It's an absolute dimensional kind of fix. You've got the big window and the small window. You've got layers. So you've got the stone on the outside, then you've got the interior with a place to bunch a curtain, which is actually in the position that water is, there's a downpipe here, so that water is pulled through the facade because there are secret gutters here. You can see that sort of strange diagonal. That's a fall on a metal gutter. And if I take you back to that building now, it's weathered very beautifully because of that detail. The secret gutter in the recess. So what was the recess in the sketch becomes a clear manifestation of a rhythm of thicker bits of wall and thinner bits of wall. The thicker bit takes a wash basin and clothes, a storage, and then reverses to the other side for a room. So you get a kind of back-to-back spine, thicker wall, recess, 3 meter or 3.3 meter, if I remember correctly, lintel, and back. So this is the detail for that planning of the big jamb, little architrave, you know, that allows that flexibility. There's the niche for the cleaning. There's a little wooden shutter that closes the little window and a curtain that closes the other one, and in the place that the curtain bunches is the downpipe that picks up that fall on that. So that sounds, I know, a lot of detail, but this is then the configuration. Actually, some lines have got missed off here, but you can see the big lintel with an open joint there, which is just for movement, because if you get a 3.3 meter length of something, it's trying to move. The idea here was to make a self-supporting wall of stone. So it's not load-bearing, but it's self-supporting over 3 floors. So you have an external skin of stone. It's only 75 mil thick. That is, in plan, has at the wider bits here a blockwork pier as well. And the interesting thing is, when this is south-facing to the sun, the external skin of this moves about 15 millimeters compared to the interior, because the interior is very stable. You know, the exterior is going very cold, very warm. The movement in this and the joints and the size of the joints is all incredibly important. So this is the pressed gutter that happens at this point, and that means there's no, actually that is not typical as it happens. This is to the outside. So this is where we have a sill rather than a gutter that's picking it up. So, but if I go back just very briefly, if this will work. Yeah, one more. There we go. Here you can see those gutters, and the stone is as clean as this today, you know, as it was when it was finished as a result of that. It actually all issues out over a harder stone at the ground, so they're picking up, you know, 1, 2, and then issuing over that point there. I mean, there are bits of detailing I still go back to check it out, but that little pressing there, that it's actually in reality slightly further forward, just allows the water to drip rather than stain the front. I mean, it's incredibly important for architecture, this idea of weathering. You may want the staining, you may not. Buildings change their entire appearance. It's amazing to look at St. Paul's Cathedral. You know, before it was cleaned, it was landscape, because the weathering bands are very horizontal. Suddenly it's clean, everything's vertical. I mean, everything changes through weathering in terms of your perception of a building. So I know that's not the kind of thing that you know, worries you at this stage, but it's really the stuff of practice. So there we are. It gets to its most extraordinary when you have something like a sundial to deal with. So it was an idea I had for this blank wall, which I really like, because they have a common room, they have a history of science, and this is like making the building speak. So sounds easy, but you need several people involved in this. You need a dialist, you need a carver, and you need the designer, you know, of the whole, as it were. But this gnomon, which has that block on it, which creates a shadow here, these beautiful forms here are called the equation of time, because the Earth wobbles, and it's not precise as a digital watch. It changes up to about 15 minutes in terms of time, solar time to digital time, as it were, over the year. And it's a wonderful thing, you know. The dialist is part of the computer faculty, and they had there the first internet site. It's now kind of a sacred site, where the coffee machine, it was used first. The first site was a coffee machine in Cambridge, linked to America. So that anyway, the people in the faculty could see when the coffee was ready, and you know. He used this dial as the basis of his first year, actually undergraduate examinations. But he could have used them as questions for PhD students, because you know, the world, the understanding of the world and astrophysics is embedded in this. The point I'm going to make just very briefly is you cannot have this stone moving separate to that. So this is the one piece of stone that is not self-supporting, but is held on an angle so that you don't get that movement. This was established with a triangulation based on satellites. So it's incredibly accurate. It's a kind of wonderful thing, this simple thing on a building that can just lead you into this extraordinary world. So it was a stone building. And it was a beautiful exercise for us. I made 23 trips to quarries on my search for the stone, and ended using some of that stone, as I say, as a harder stone on the ground. A lot of that time was spent on the A1 because there were great limestones around the A1. In the end, this is Bath stone, but with a base of a stone called Auville from North France. In France, I realized another thing about stone was, on about the 7th day of my tripping to these quarries, you would stop and you would be having a meal. And you realize that stone and wine, the terroir of wine and cheese all go together, the geology. It's something incredibly profound about the sort of sense of geological time and what it does. So it's a strong one. The second one, could we just, I'm taking a break, actually. There's a 6-minute movie about the second example of stone, which is a little event down on London Bridge. There are a number of films we've made about projects. These aren't actually on the net yet, but will be. So this is not quite the final edit, but I thought I'd show it to you. And then we'll move to the third example of stonework after that. The point about this one is that it's about load-bearing stone.
You might walk past 5 days a week for 40 years of your working life and not really reflect on it very much. Why is it there? What's it doing?
London Bridge is the kind of battleground between Southwark and the City of London. This was the stopping space in London with its brothels and theatres before you came to the old bridgehead with its gateway, which marked the City of London on the south side of the Thames. The bit between was a kind of no man's land, still is in many ways. It was a completely forlorn wasteland, a battleground in planning terms and traffic engineering. It became evident that if you were to cut it, create cutting through the difference in the landscape, you could turn what was a conduit for spewing commuters over the bridge or sucking them back at night, and turn it about with a set of steps and a marker. The marker is a marker that, if you follow its trajectory, pierces the ground around the point of the termination of the old London Bridge. So it's actually a marker that is a reminder of the extraordinary history of this threshold, the front door, if you like, from Europe and the world to the City of London.
Eric's needle is very much a sign. It's a stone obelisk, a canted obelisk, which indicates that there's something going on around it, that there's a change of condition between north and south. This needle evokes cubist, revolutionary, expressionist, modernist ideas, but it also foreshadows things like the shard, I think.
Well, it's certainly taken something from it. There's no denying that. It's quite pleasant to see that. It's nice to see it looking good after some 18 years' time. Some people might be saddened about the old Cupid edges or so, but that's what happens to stone in London. It becomes an old friend.
Building of the needle is a very sophisticated piece of engineering by the master mason Henri of Rome.
It was quite intensive hard work. For the needle to stay at the angle it is, the slenderness of it, you have to intensify all the procedures within stone selection, workmanship, tolerances in manufacture, and the whole ethos of putting the structure together. We had to set it all out by hand.
It is made very beautifully out of triangular shaped blocks of stone that are given a spooling so they sit one into the other, and they're tied together by a series of stainless steel rods that are tensioned to take the charge of the weight.
The blocks are separated by lime mortar, which allows for flexing because this takes a lot of wind load.
If we didn't get the stone thing right, the water thing right, this thing could have failed. At times we thought, well, I hope this works. So I'm glad it has.
This is a piece of world that touches historic time and the old bridge, but also the craftsmanship of today. It's a line between the ground and the sky, between two territories, between the north and the south bank. It's trying to create something of a place.
The medium is a particularly poignant example of how an architectural object can create a moment for and of reflection.
Okay, I love those hands. They're fantastic. Amazing guy. Right, so let's move to the next. There was a lesson in that project, which was a great experiment. I should say the engineers were Adams Cara Taylor, very early on. Great. But it was a lesson about, in that post-tensioning stone, about pulling stone together, making it a kind of structural element. So I started to get very excited about this idea of using stone in a load-bearing way, as opposed to the self-supporting way of Pembroke. And this, a lot of the work that I've been fortunate to get to do has been to do with planning. In fact, if I think about it, every project has a kind of, alongside the technical saga, a terrifying birth cycle with planning. My client here had been through 1 or 2 architects, and they came in desperation, I think, at that point to us, because we didn't have a big track record. But this is Finsbury Square. It's a square with has a kind of set of rules, planning-wise, and it was to do with using Portland stone, because the other buildings had been made in Portland stone, It was to do with what you did with the top, which was you could have kind of 6 stories and then you had 2 setbacks of mansards and things like that. The assumption being that it's still clerks in the attic, you know, and you have boardrooms on the first floor. This was a locally listed building, so my job was to get a permission for a building that would take up half of one side of a late Georgian square that used to be formed by, you know, 100 front doors. And now it's probably about 10, but huge numbers of people work here. So it's outside the city. And actually Occupy were in here, you may remember. So it's a very interesting battleground. It's actually a bowling green here, a kind of quite good Spanish restaurant. It's over a car park, which has 2 entrances. So there's a defunct filling station here and on the front, in fact. So we went in with the Latzes to make a new kind of public space here, which would have been sunken, and we'd have reused the stone from this building. In the end, that wasn't to be, and it's still a kind of wasteland, actually. You know, it could be much better than it is. Anyway, I'm sorry this is so washed out, but actually it's a fairly strong pencil drawing in its original form. I must do something about that. But this is a drawing pre-planning that just looked at this idea of an exoskeleton of stone. So a building that wouldn't have a steel frame, which it doesn't have. It's described by a good friend of mine as kind of being a high-tech Stone Age building. And there wasn't any precedent, so it was very difficult to do it, actually. But it is load-bearing, and as the loads diminish as you go up, the separation of the stone gets greater until you get to this sort of loggia at the top, and the 2 setbacks then are a celebration rather than an apology for the top. And as you get to the bottom, you may see that these stones here are just slightly thicker. These are 400 millimeters thick by, you know, more or less 900 wide. And they go up to 600 at the base, just because of the loading. And this is with Whitby and Bird, Mark Whitby and co, and a man called Des Mayer. So what you're seeing is that the loads are taken directly from the floors onto these horizontal beams and thence into the stone piers, which are all made off-site because you had to build these things quickly, these offices. This is just built for the same money as an ordinary office. So that's, I would emphasize. The reason it's load-bearing, and the interesting thing, this is for me was a campaign about using stone properly rather than as kind of bathroom tiling, you know, which you see all over the place. And so we had to go through the process of designing it. The first thing was that when you put a steel frame up, you know, you then clad it. This building had to be built level by level, you can see. So it was done horizontally rather than putting a steel frame up and then cladding it. And each of the piers had to come just in time. So they'd arrive, be yanked up, then the next slab they'd be connected and the next slab would be put in. And this is the sort of system. So you have your pre-cambered beams spanning 16 meters, and they come to a connecting plate, which is like a shear plate, which is sticking out of the back of this horizontal element here. And that's picking up weathering, so learning from Pembroke. The precast then falls to outlets at every 6 meters, and they don't fall across a joint. So it's actually, and then you get to the tyranny of the grid, the office grid, which is all 1.5 meter centers behind that. So you're working from the lyricism of the front, which is composed and to do with moving into the entrance from that grid that you have to work with. So this is the outside of the building. There's an encapsulated horizontal beam going back to this stub, which then gets connected to the big beams. These are wonderful, hefty pieces. So the water falls back into this channel and then down a downpipe, and that downpipe is encapsulated in the facade, like the Pembroke facade. And the space between the back and the window and the pier gives you the depth. So I said, okay, you know, they were trying to put the old building on steroids and sort of replicate it. And I said, right, I need 900 millimeters, don't touch that, and I'll give you the most efficient floor plate I can behind that, but that's not for negotiation. So you get the depth, so the stone is actually doing a solar shading job. From the inside of the office, you're looking to the back of the stone, which is very pleasant, so it's like a stoa. And you have a curtain wall with a lot of glass in it. So here's the glass typically. Here are your stones. Learning from Southwark with pre-tensioned blocks that come together with a bridge bearing joint at the bottom of each, because this thing flexes. So it's quite live. So those are the elements. This is down in Poole. 4 stonemasons making up all the stone piers in literally 4 blocks, made to plus or minus 1 millimetre. So they're actually sawn and then they're shaved to this very precise dimension. So you have tiny fill of. They're beautiful when you look at them. You look at the jointing; it's haptically incredibly pleasant. You know, when you go to a developer or a construction manager, they say, "Okay, let's start with 10 mil joints, right?" And then you go, and then they say the industry standard is 6 mil. So I was wanting plus or minus 1 millimetre on this, and I have endless battles about joints and lengths of lintel and stuff like that, because it's everything. I mean, you've got to get the architecture right, but actually jointing is fantastically important in how you feel the building. Anyway, so this is the interior. No steel framework. Just these stubs going into these monsters. You see, so these are at 3 metre centres. There is a beautiful casting of stooling to take. So there's a raised piece that's falling to take each of those stone piers. Now, if you realise that every pier is in a slightly erratic place, you've got to realise the working drawings and the coordination to make this work when it hits site is very precise. It really takes a lot to get that together. Anyway, that gives you the beauty in my mind of these corners, which are open. You clean the windows from, by the way, by walking on this space here, so you don't have a kind of gantry mucking around here. And then at night, obviously, it has this wonderful skiography. So it's like and during the day, it's like a kind of a dial in itself, because you get those extraordinary shadows that I showed you on the back of the building to the street, which is much tighter. And that sort of civic space from the outside is because of that business of being on a square, being half a square, needing that kind of tectonic to have an authority. On the back, it's really tight, and I love this. You see there's a kind of irrationality here with the way in which the meeting styles gives you the planning grid for the office behind. So those are the 3 stone projects, and I want to move then to ceramic, and I have 3 projects. Won't take as long. But it starts actually for me with this wall at Wimbledon School of Art. There's a new building. This was a space that was occupied with some sheds from the Festival of Britain, some of the site huts, and they were just falling to bits, and they needed new space, new studio space. It's a very nice brief studio space, as flexible as possible, that can open up for a show at the end of the year. There's a kind of student cafe in this big block, and then in the block on the first floor is a room which is like a TV studio, allows them to do installation work and work with sound and light. There was a teacher who was here called John Mitchell, very, very good artist in his own right. And he'd been working with these kind of conical sections and colour and light. So he devised this wall, and we said we'd build it in brick. There are 7 tones of blue and 7 tones of red that move each way. And this is the first time I'd worked with Shores of Darwin, who glazed the tones of this on the bricks. And I liked their laboratory and the way they worked, so that was great. Here's the site plan, very simply, the new building in black, set into this sort of suburban world. A terrible planning nightmare. In the end, it's kind of quite tight, but this is like with the AKT again. These are goalposts, right, that travel across the space, create a north light, to the underside of which you can hang divisions during the year, but otherwise it can be this sort of 60-metre long space. and there's a theatre door that opens up so that this space can extend into the two-story block, which looks like this. So this is the internal, acoustically separated, passively controlled sort of experimental space for installation work. Anyway, so that was the first meeting with Shores of Darwin, since when we've done quite a lot of work with them. The next project, just thinking about, so that's a sort of art for art, you know, the art project, glazing, ceramic, hard bricks, Dutch white bricks, and sort of sense of reflectivity to this little courtyard in the school. Here we get to the problem that I was given with a competition to rework a museum at this point here. So what you have, you know, you've got the great sort of set pieces of Bath, like the Crescent and the Circus, and this world of Georgian, kind of extraordinary Georgian ambition. Adams Pulteney Bridge here, and this is the Pulteney Estate. And it's built, Great Pulteney Street is fantastic. It's 600 metres, built as a causeway across marshes. And then it terminated in this pleasure garden. So this is it's the only extant 18th century pleasure garden. You know, Ranelagh, Vauxhall, they all disappeared under obviously development in London. This one is there as this lozenge, and 40 years before Nash's Regent's Park, it was a brilliant idea having houses that went round it, that looked into it, and then a ride for kind of on horseback around the edge, and then you came in, there were fireworks, an amazing world of the imagination, really, for the town. Quite a fantastic place. It fell out of favour. The entry building, which was like a casino, a gambling space, and the way into the pleasure garden, had become a school and then had been sealed off in the early 19th century, 1916, 20th century rather, from the park beyond. So you had to kind of come around the edges then to get into the park. So this is the Holborn Museum, which houses this collection. This great 19th century collector, William Holborn. These are the original openings. Now, you went through that to the pleasure gardens. In 1916 reworking, this was opened up. It wasn't actually an open loggia at that point. And this architect, who is very well known at this point, the early 20th century, called Reginald Blomfield, adapts the building to create a double-height picture gallery here and a ballroom on the first floor, and they're very good rooms. But he had no idea about how to, you know, you wouldn't do it now to cut off the building from the park. It's kind of insane. So that's what he did on the backside. There's a wall that comes around here, an exedral wall, cutting you off from the garden. He blocked up the entrance with a staircase, so there was a staircase that went up here. There's no opening into the garden from this side. It was falling to bits. The servicing was shot. The lift, which was in here, didn't quite get to the top floor because he didn't want it to appear above his parapet, so there were 4 steps at the top, so there's disability access problems and issues. And actually, it was about to be shut up, you know, and it could have been. And then, when we failed on our first attempt with planning, they literally were about to have the vans from Sotheby's come and take the lot away. So there was this kind of gift to Bath of an HLF amount of money, and the Bathonians really took against this. On the second planning application, there were 1,200 respondents to the application, if you can imagine that. Usually you might expect 1 or 2 people to get off and write something. 1,200. 60 in favour in the end, 40 against, so we actually won. But it was because I wanted to work with ceramic in the garden rather than stone. Because I wanted a building that would breathe the spirit of this. This is what it was like. You used to come through, there was a gauze here with Apollo and his lyre, a band above you. You know, so imagine coming out of that rigid classical world of the street into this band here. Supper boxes ranged in a great enfilade around here. It's a kind of pickup joint, you know, but it's also fireworks displays. There's a swing going on in the back here. There's a hermit, cascade, labyrinth. It's an amazing world, actually. And this was one of my competition sketches, which suggested lightness, levitation, something of that gauze again, reflection, a world between night and day. I had Magritte in my mind in some way, because this is always in the shadow, this side, as you perhaps see from that image. So this is the condition before. He'd gutted it, this Reginald Blomfield, and it had no temporary exhibition space, so that was a real problem for a contemporary museum. It's the lifeblood. It had no cafe and so on. So he stuck his stair here. So we had to move the stair across. It's a Grade 1 listed building, and it's a World Heritage Site. So it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So it's kind of quite sensitive. But the idea here was to re-engage that axis, to reconnect the building with the garden, placing a new lift here, and a kind of rising of services here, and try and create as little structure, taking the structure off the corner to dematerialize it on the ground floor. Creating an education room, very importantly, and a shop and so on, but also an invigilation point. This has to be very low maintenance, so there's one person can effectively run most of the museum from this reception desk. So we go to the first floor, this great ballroom which we unjammed. It was full of sarcophagi with a riot of little things that you couldn't really make sense of. And then to create, in the height of that ballroom, 2 floors here. So the idea was very low ceilings to put in what was essentially a domestic collection of Hobans into this precious casket behind a glass and ceramic skin. So ceramic here, and then glass on the outside with these fins that stabilize the glass. Then on the upper level, the mezzanine, you had a little staircase that took you up to and then you get views into the garden, very importantly. And there's this magical moment here where now you're at the top of the stair and you look into the gardens one way and you look down this wonderful street the other. So it's like a focal point. And then the top floor, coming further out, it's like it cantilevers out, creates the exhibition space, which is top lit. So it's like a picture gallery. This is top lit, beautifully lit by these 3 oculi here. Great way, that's the way to see pictures with top light, or sculpture. So it's these 2 top lit spaces, and you can now transfer paintings from here there. This is then a ceramic wall. So I had the problem, which wasn't evident in that sketch at the beginning, to put the heaviest bit of the building on top. So this is my first sketch of an idea of a ceramic wall and glass. And I wanted the reciprocity between ceramic and glass, glazing, the crafted surface, the reflected surface seemed to me to work. So it's not insubstantial, totally transparent, but it has then I didn't want the grid to exist too strongly here, like, this conversation with Finsbury Square. So there's a regular line going through for tile heights, and then the vertical joint is hidden in the vertical element, which is a fin that goes through to pick up glazing, and then glazing with ceramic behind and a grid, and then glass and glass. So it's like a triple glaze system. So these are early sketches of the Janus-headed kind of quality, the town and the garden side, with the total transparency. It's exactly the opposite. You've got total transparency here, and it gets heavier. Whereas this starts with an urn and ends up with rustication. So it's a very, for me, you couldn't fly. That's terribly meek, I'm afraid. I couldn't fly stone around this building unless it was a very exotic stone or something. It just doesn't work for me. Stone picks up load as it gets to the ground. It's a very important quality of the material. So anyway, here's the basic section. The opening here, cafe here, archive below, ballroom, 2 heights for the intimate collection, the new temporary exhibition here, the permanent exhibition there. So you get, from a curatorial perspective, you get the coming and going across here. And this is how that section works, with the ceramic fins backed and held by a stainless steel element, which is the real structure, pinned back to the ceramic interior here, because that's like a sheet of glass that goes a long, long way. I mean, it's, this is like 5 meters, this is 4, so it's like 9 meters. So here it is, as built, with that openness. You're looking right through sort of several layers of glass. So it's low iron glass. Then you get the outer layer of glass and the ceramic behind it, and then the ceramic on the outside. And therefore the shadowing and so on. And actually, photographs don't do it justice in a way, because it's always animated by movement of the leaves, for instance. You get these very beautiful shadows off the glazes. And this is the connection where I just dropped natural light. This is the old Blomfield window cut. You know, it's a wonderful collection of Gainsborough's and other paintings in the permanent, and then there's a contemporary space on the back side. So that's the building. This is the refurbished top gallery, where actually all the environmental control, so, you know, from an environmental point of view, you're getting from passive, absolutely passive control on the ground, then a bit more control on the first floor, and then very tight control here. So there's a slot, a return air there, and these ducts cut into the existing plaster deliver air, tempered air, into this space. And this is that kind of tight space. This is actually as he had his collection. So from the inventory, everything is known about what he had on these tables. So this is recreating his kind of study, this cacophony of things. And there are beautiful elements behind in small Dutch genre paintings, but you're always connected to the garden and you're getting light, where you've got areas where you need total darkness, area with porcelain, ceramic, where you don't need it. And this is the new temporary exhibition on the top floor space, with one exhibition called Presence, which is about portrait sculpture. I mean, it was a lovely little exhibition. And this is it in its different guise with Peter Blake's collection on top of the Hoban collection. So this is the temporary space that will allow, you know, put sculpture here or block that central bit off, and you always get light on the wall otherwise. The floor is actually like a little parquet. It's end grain. It's quite cheap actually. That's why this was amazing. This whole project was £7 million. So £3.5 million on the existing building, 3.5 more or less on the new building. So very, very tight budget. And this is the process, Shores of Darwin, just finishing off from, these are cast rather than extruded. So there's that kind of hand tooling, and then the glazing, which is a two layers of glaze, single fired. It's a very crafted product. It's not an art product. And the last project, which I'll go through quite quickly and it will be revealed soon, is where I wanted to use, because of its location, a much more an artificial idea of using ceramic, much more something that was to do with polychromy. It had the art project in it and so on. So this is where we are. You can see that I call this kind of urban dentistry in a way, because this was a bunch of shot buildings, to be fair to them, and a hole in the center with sort of lots of staircases that you couldn't get up with, no lifts, and really, really difficult. It's the first of the Crown estates. Their leases, you know, Regent Street has been done over the last 10 years because the leases in Regent Street were 99 years long. When they came in, they were able to do the refurbishment of Regent Street. They're now starting their estate in St James, and this is the first one, so hence the name, the St James Gateway project. So this is where it was. Blomfield again. God, he's here. He gets everywhere. I mean, Norman Shaw, Blomfield at one end. These guys had an idea of urban blocks, and they thought, you know, Piccadilly was going to be like the Rue de Rivoli, effectively. You know, so if you go to the Ritz, it has that colonnade. It's exactly what was in mind. You have a cornice height that they set, and then it suddenly drops because you kind of get three buildings that were part of the 19th century. Then you get this very eclectic building, and look at that, you know, it was barons, and it was covered in this stuff. And it was originally a very nice mitered corner with a corbel kind of echoing the Waterhouse Bank building here. So actually, I wanted to keep this as a sort of stabilizing element. We have a new building on the other side, and then a retained facade on the back. I also registered that if I raised this building by about 6 foot, I could run, the horizons are very important here, the cornice line. I could run floors through this to create a more open office behind. So what we have is a project, which I won't go into in detail, but it has retail at the base and in Jermyn Street. It goes round to Jermyn Street. An office entrance off this passage, which is called Eagle Place. Residential with the uplift in the back. So it's much more of an urban design project than capital A architecture. But I really enjoy that. It's a kind of collage to make the block work again. So this is where it was, and this was my first sketch of it, of what I was trying to do, which was to register that cornice. Even at this stage, I knew I wanted an art project on the cornice. There's a kind of red that you can just see in these. So there's a double order which responds to the double order of Shaw and Blomfield and others. There's a sort of lower level here above the retail here, and you can just see that these lines run through. So there's a kind of floor level. And then this is reworked very much as it was, but a bit higher. So this has been taken down stone by stone, stored off-site, it's brought back, and it's now been put back together. And the stone is brilliant. Why throw it away? It's fantastic. It's sort of got a patina, and it's like Andre Verona and his hand on the buffeted edges of the Southwark Gateway. This is terrible CGI. Ignore it. It's for sales, but. I went through the process I put together a list of artists that I thought would be great polychromists. And for this, including Cy Twombly, who's since died and said he was too busy and blah. I then enlisted the help of two great art critics, Richard Cork and Paul Morehouse, and we interviewed, on behalf of the Crown, the artists and chose Richard Deacon. And to cut a long story short, he came up with this sort of extraordinary idea, because he's been working on this sort of sense of folded elements. Now, what's happened there? It's come beautifully blank. Maybe this will just remain as a surprise. I thought I had it, but yeah, there's nothing there. Fantastic. What a way to end.
Get back to it.
Oh, look. Sorry?
55?
It could be. Yeah, here we go. Right. So, I don't know if you can wind it back. Let's leave it here. Here is Richard Deacon. This is a dry lay, right, in Lancashire. So, we've got a kind of polychromy, and it's a white elevation. It's mug white. It's not white. And that's the white that you see on these edges. And then within the architecture are these red cheeks, so that it's got a blush. Because this is north facing, so as an elevation, the great thing about ceramic is that it reflects on those wet, miserable London days. This building will kind of start to have an animation. Remember, it's right at the end near Eros and Piccadilly Circus and that liveliness. So I wanted to have this artificiality. And the red and the black is working with that. And it rises to the cornice, which is made of 39 pieces. I did have the drawings somewhere. This is the dry lay of the whole elevation view as a few of the working drawings. Here it is on site, so you can see the quality of the glaze actually, and then now this is them putting in the cornice, so you can see that cornice behind. This is what you were talking about, Will, that, you were seeing some of these blocks. Some of these pieces are about 200 kilos heavy. They're made of 30 mil, it's 30 mil wall of ceramic. Not as big as the Holborn actually. And it's set by stonemasons, so it's not like a rain screen. It's lime mortared, and we'll see what it looks like. But this is it coming on. These are left out actually, so we can put there's a little weathering that goes across these. So 39 pieces of a series of sections, and then he did colorways. So he painted these colourways, and we had a fantastic time working with transfers between the kilns in Staffordshire, where these are made up. So that each of these is a transfer, like if you were into modelling and you had decals on plastic aeroplanes and things, you put them on with water and then brush them down. Exactly the same technique, which is used in ceramics, but it's kind of died out, as you know, the tragedy of Wedgwood and the Staffordshire industry. So we resurrected it. And some of these are quite sophisticated. They've got like 8 screens. So you're putting a ceramic mix, which is then fired onto the ceramic. The ceramic elements are fired up at 1200 or thereabouts degrees. And that means that they're completely water resistant. And then at a lower temperature, about 850, there's a second firing, which means that the transfer medium burns away, and the ceramic glaze is absorbed into the surface. So it's really, it's bonded in, it's, you know, as a glaze. So that is the corners going in. These are the sort of details of, these are beautiful sill pieces. The great thing about this is that you have 6 bays, so you get a lot of kind of complexity in the section. But because there are 6 of them, you repeat. So there's a sort of very interesting way in which ceramic is different to stone and stone cutting. So yeah, that's more or less it. But you can see here, you get very complex sections working very nicely throughout the building, and then terminating in this great cornice. So it's absolutely to do with artifice and not craft in a way, and that's what I look forward to celebrating with this building over the other ones. That's from the glazed brick to this is a sort of little journey. So each of these materials comes with a journey. The cycle is one, of course, a desire to push a material further, but it's also to do with the idea of where the building is, which is where I started by talking about the potency of contact. So thank you very much.